I've gone on record saying that D&D is likely more popular now than it's ever been, and even though most of the world's population has been quarantined for the past couple of months, the viability of online play hasn't changed this. I've made a whole video about how this is great, but the problem is that plenty of people aren't even aware that other tabletop RPGs exist, and there are plenty more that vaguely know of other systems, but don't really know how to start getting into them. Normally, I wouldn't have a problem with the market having a clear winner like this, especially since D&D actually is one of my favorite systems, but in this case, D&D is so disproportionately oversaturated that it's not even fair to other systems. So yeah, here I am to recommend some of my favorite systems that I think people should try out. Now, I definitely don't think you should go out and buy all these books and play every single one of these games right away, because I don't want to waste your time or money, and not all these games are for everyone. That said, a lot of these games are open source, so you can try them out without spending money on them with the basic rules, which I'll link in the description when appropriate. I'll be sorting this list into 3 broad categories: systems that are similar to D&D but sort of complex, systems that are easy to learn but very different from D&D, and systems that are both out there and complex but I really like anyway. The first game in that first category is Starfinder. It's essentially the sci-fi spin-off of Pathfinder, which is essentially a reworked 3rd edition of D&D, also known as the second best version of D&D, don't at me. If you ask me, this is pretty much the go-to space age game for D&D players. It's fairly new and really well balanced. Most of the basic mechanics are what you'd expect with the D20 and class levels and whatnot, but it's distinct enough that it doesn't quite feel like a reskin of D&D. The space combat system in particular is really cool. The default setting also does a pretty good job inserting fantasy tropes into a sci-fi framework. The setting is basically a medieval fantasy world a couple thousand years into the future, so you get things like dragon CEOs and dwarf asteroid miners. My only major complaint is that the economy and leveling system is kind of whack. It sort of has Skyrim syndrome. Like, once you hit high levels, all the generic goons are carrying ultra-powered weapons that would totally unbalance the game if a single one fell into the hands of a low-level character. This is excusable in a video game, but it really breaks immersion in tabletop, especially in a space-age setting where high-level equipment should probably be easily replicated. Still, this game is pretty much flawless at low levels, and if you want to play D&D in space, this is your game. Now, for people who want to play D&D with superheroes, I'd recommend Mutants and Masterminds. If you want to look at the rules, they're open source, so is Starfinder, and I've linked the wiki in the description. This system is both very streamlined and extremely customizable. All the roles use a d20, and it's based on a point-buy system instead of classes and levels. You can detail your powers and skills however you want, and I honestly can't think of any superhero or power that couldn't be statted out in this game. The only warning I'll give about Mutants and Masterminds is that superhero games in general actually aren't the easiest to run. The conflicts are generally character and event-based rather than location-based, and keeping track of space during fights can be pretty challenging when the heroes are flying at Mach speed above the skyline of Manhattan. But I'd imagine it's easier than high-level D&D, especially since the system is surprisingly balanced too, so if you've done that, it won't be too hard. Now we're getting to the stage of games that are easy to learn, but don't share many similarities with D&D, and this includes pretty much all of the Powered by the Apocalypse games. This label doesn't refer to a specific genre or publisher, but rather a set of systems whose rules are all based on Apocalypse World by Lumpley Games. Pretty much all of them are less focused on the intricacies of combat tactics than a game like D&D, opting for a more abstract conflict system, and plenty of rules designed to shape the narrative. Instead of a D&D character gaining a feat that lets them stun undead when hitting them in a mace, Powered by the Apocalypse character might get a trait that guarantees that every time they walk into a tavern, they'll know somebody who can give useful advice about the adventure. My favorite PBTA game is probably Masks, which is another superhero game, but very different from Mutants and Masterminds. It's specifically focused on teenage heroes like Teen Titans and New Avengers, and it has plenty of mechanics for character drama, with fighting and powers being largely a metaphor for the struggles and journeys of coming of age. Seriously, the most common effect of taking damage is getting your feelings hit real hard. All the rules are super creative and encourage players to take the game just seriously enough, while still having a ton of fun. If you want to try a character-driven superhero game, this is definitely the system for you. Another great PBTA game is Monster of the Week, which is based on urban fantasy monster hunting shows like Supernatural and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. It has a really nice tone that strikes a balance between comedy and action. The other one I'd recommend is Dungeon World, which is basically a more narrativist, rules-light version of D&D. There are a ton of other great PBTA games, like the original Apocalypse World, that are at least partially open source, and I haven't played all of them, so check them out if you're curious. My final, easier system is sort of an anomaly in that it doesn't work like other RPGs at all. I know that a lot of role-playing sessions end up being pretty silly, but if you want to play a one-off game that's just balls-to-the-wall ridiculous, I'd try Everyone as John. Basically, everyone except the GM is playing the same character, which is only possible because he has split personalities, and each player plays a voice in John's head trying to accomplish their chosen obsession, and stop the other players from getting to theirs. That's right, this game is actually competitive. It has a winner and a loser. One player might be trying to get John to set off a nuclear bomb, and the other one might be trying to start a shelter for stray kittens. This game is absurdly simple and absurdly fun. I'd recommend trying it out in between campaigns or something. Finally, I'd recommend two systems that both don't resemble D&D and are a little more on the complex side, but I'd still recommend you check them out if you're into the concepts. The first of these is Call of Cthulhu, which is a horror mystery game based on the stories of H.P. Lovecraft. The setting is just so cool, and it lends itself really well to an RPG adventure. That is, as long as everyone is aware that it's a horror game, not an action game. The entire theme of the setting is that humanity is insignificant in comparison to the alien gods of the Cthulhu mythos. If a player thinks that they can just solve every problem by running into danger with guns blazing, then they're going to have an even more untimely death than the rest of the party. But if everyone knows what to expect, this game is downright thrilling. And now onto my last recommendation. Have you seen that movie Bright on Netflix? You know, that movie set in modern Los Angeles, but with orcs and elves and magic and bad metaphors for racism? If you wish that movie was good, then Shadowrun might be for you. It's a hybrid of fantasy and cyberpunk, with dragon CEOs hiring orcish street samurai and psychic hackers. Needless to say, there are so many possible adventures in a setting like this that coming up with adventure ideas is a breeze. Mechanically, it's based on rolling tons of d6s, and it's at least as deep as D&D in terms of combat and skill systems. If you like modern fantasy, you should maybe check it out. So yeah, those are my favorite RPG systems that you may or may not have heard of. Obviously, there are a ton of great games beyond those too, like the sprawling collection of urban fantasy systems that make up the World of Darkness, but I don't have enough experience to comment on those systems. But if anyone on the comments wants to recommend something, feel free to do so. Anyway, thanks for watching the video, see y'all next time.